Good morning, beautiful people of the internet, and welcome once more to our Sunday special live, joined as always by the loquacious Helen Chorley, the stunning Piotr Rusinek, and the ever-growing in intellect Adam Lawrence. Let's kick this off. What is Sunday all about? What are we going to do next week? Is everybody looking forward to Christmas now that Halloween is over? I just want to get
43 days.
I know. It's the ever-increasing march of fun and frivolity, followed by tissel and tansel and whatever else goes on. Adam doesn't look too impressed by the thought of it. There's an impending dread and doom on his face when I mention Christmas. Like, oh God, not that again. Not that. Not every year.
We could do with the
uptick. Could we use the uptick in GDP for Christmas? Could we all do with that? The economy could do with Christmas once, all right? Maybe you should go out and really splurge. Maybe do your bit for the economy, Adam. You know, step up.
It's a bit inflationary for me, Chief. To be honest with you, I think we need to be cautious. But I'm not sure this housing market needs another break right now. Really, that's what's going through the back of my mind there. But you never know. It might be that the new year is what it needs to get itself kick-started and crack on in a meaningful way. You never know.
You never know. Well, I saw something interesting. It's completely meaningless for the entire planet, of course, but the last day of the year, if you were to write it out, is 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Well, only if you're American.
Oh,
only if you're American, yeah.
They're the only country in the world that use that format. Yeah, for inexplicable reasons that have always eluded me, to be honest.
There are a lot of things about the Americas that elude me, but their date system is not the worst of them.
Fair.
Yeah.
The Sunday supplement seemed really interesting.
Yeah, I had a bit of a soapbox moment this week. Really, I guess I can these days I gauge it by how long the audio file is, apart from anything else, and we're a good 7 or 8 minutes longer than the average of recent weeks and months. So I was like, I must have been on a bit of a rant there. So I did promise last week that I would get stuck into the Bank of England minutes from the meeting, because there's a lot of speculation. There's this really horrific meme that's been doing the rounds of, here's what the interest rates will be for the next 2 years, and then people are sharing it left, right, and centre like they've got some kind of. It's funny what appeals to people to share on social media, like they've got some kind of. I don't know. The governor some days knows how to tie his own shoes, let alone know what the rate decisions are going to be for the next 18 months. So why would you think that that's the case? It must be. I haven't traced the origin of it because, frankly, I've got better things to do with my time. But I imagine it's some kind of conspiratorial. All the lizards meet together once every 6 weeks to determine how they control the populace or whatever, rather than believing that the.
If you listen to the latest interviews with Noreen Davies, you'd be inclined to agree with that speculation, Adam. You've heard of Noreen Davies, the MP that disappeared, where she was running her constituency from, doing her, I think, Bedford constituency. She completely disappeared. She got removed as an MP, and now she's doing the rounds on news channels talking about like a cabal of Illuminati-style characters that actually determine the future. Your vote doesn't matter.
What I adore is that her name is actually Nadine Dorries, but I can understand why you've got it wrong, because, and I think Noreen Davies is much, much better and more fitted to her ability. But yeah, she was the mid-beds candidate who then, did 0 surgeries or whatever that she was obligated to do, and seemed to be kind of, in a most charitable way I can put it, represents the new breed of MP who gets elected as an MP to then springboard a career as a poor man's David Icke or whatever you want to call that, and get a gig with GB News. Although I'm not sure targeting media companies that are losing 30 million quid a year is the most sensible thing to do. Although I do think that GB News will probably be massive in the fullness of time, because we get more and more like America all the time, and Fox rules the roost these days in the States, whereas the CNBCs and all the rest of it are, fading away into relative insignificance by comparison. And I was quite pleased the other day to see there were more people at one point who were watching a Facebook Live that I did than were watching someone live on GB News. So that was a nice ego booster for the Times. But yeah, there's she is, I guess, the QAnon leader of the UK, or something like that. Make Britain great again, or whatever. Staunch supporter of Boris, despite what's evidently gone wrong from having a Boris administration. And we've got this. The Conservative Party looks to me like a really sad state of affairs for the next 5 to 10 years, as they sort of get, Sunak loses, Sunak gets booted, Truss stands again, which won't be good for my blood pressure apart from anything else. Hopefully, Badenoch will take the further right of the party's vote rather than Truss. You would hope, because Badenoch is a pretty decent heterodox thinker who I think gets labelled as further right than she actually really is. She's just one of those awkward people who says things that are true, and people go, "Oh, that's a bit right wing, is it?" It's like, not really. It's just true. It's a bit like Peterson, occupies that space for people where they have to try and minimise him by putting him into a political box, and he's probably the hardest person on the planet to put into a box, realistically, because he just thinks what he thinks about individual issues. And he doesn't care. He's just apolitical, So Badenoch happens to be within the senior ranks of the Conservative Party, and I think she's pretty impressive as a general rule. But we can always hope, and let's see. But yeah, swinging back to, I'll have to consume a bit more Nadine if I can bear to. Jay, you seem to have sentenced me to near YouTube algorithm death there with that recommendation, but I'll have a go at it.
I saw an interview. It was BBC News, which again is not another broadcast that I spend a lot of time listening to along with GB News. But I was absolutely blown away by the level of sheer sensationalism and stupidity that she was spouting. It was magnificent. It was equal parts of magnificent and equal parts of I can't believe I'm watching this, and I turned it over.
I think it reminds me of the times in the pandemic where everyone was believing there's some kind of, master plan and all the rest of it. And I'm kind of like, but I'm struggling to believe this because I just don't see people like Johnson as competent enough to pull off some kind of global, incredible puppet master strategy. I see him as kind of really what's been exposed in the inquiry, which is doesn't really care about people. Some of it is I have some sympathy for, because you've got to take the tough decisions when you're the prime minister, and no decisions in politics are fun or funny, because it's not like, do you want the better outcome or the best outcome? It's, do you want a terrible outcome or do you want the least worst outcome? And that's the whole job. And people just don't understand that and haven't got any time for it. But that's politics and that's democracy, and it's the worst system apart from all the others, right? That's why they say what they say.
Or there may be equality between the two terrible outcomes. One may not be better or worse, but you don't know what the unintended outcomes are of picking that decision.
True.
Then you go, right, I've made this decision. I've pinned my colours to the post here. Then down the road, 6 months, it turns out that actually the unintended consequence here was worse than the unintended consequence here. But you have to be a strategician and a master influencer to really go into the depth of how those things work. And unfortunately, I don't think there is a soul in politics today capable of looking 3 moves ahead.
Well, I also think in many ways, even if someone like Cummings is a pretty smart bloke, regardless of what you think of him, and his language is as salty as Jay Howard's, as it turns out, which is rare, obviously, should be celebrated. But the thing is, the whole system, anyone would argue with any sense, you've got to be in government to do stuff, realistically, to really influence, and therefore you've got to win, and therefore you've got to win at all costs. It's not a difficult journey to go on to get there, to say, and therefore you've got to do stuff that's going to matter in the next 3 months, not the next 3 years or the next 30 years. So the system's conspired against you in the first place. And even if a Cummings or similar person in similar position, an Alistair Campbell or whoever, a hopefully very clever person or people who are sitting behind Keir Starmer, if he's going to be the elected leader, what can they do? They've got to think, okay, well, as soon as they get in, presuming that they do, which looks like a 80+% likelihood event, then they're going to have to think about how they stay in, because the next 5 years probably don't look that sweet because they're not set up very well. Whereas I think we talked about it a few weeks ago, 1997, John Major had done the unpopular stuff, the hard yards. He was in the midst of being the grey man on Spitting Image. His public relations image was terrible. But he'd done the hard work and he'd set a platform for the economy to grow. We are not there in 2024, folks. I hate to break it to anybody who hasn't been listening, but we don't have that platform. What we have is an economy that's more robust than the bears would like us to think. There's probably got fewer headlines in it than everybody would like us to think, but it's struggling to grow, and it's struggling to grow because of inflation. And any growth that is happening is realistically happening on the back of simply pouring more people into the top of the funnel, a la the huge net migration figures, which, keep GDP roughly the same and increase the population, you lower the GDP per capita. What does that do? It means people are unhappy because they're chasing the same lifestyle they had in 2021. Now, the problem is that 2021's lifestyle was falsely good because we had a pandemic and we didn't really feel any of the pain that we should. But again, people don't care. People don't think like that. They just have that high watermark yardstick. And instead of saying, and to an extent, you have to sympathise with the people because you get these messages like we're all in it together. And then all the press is reporting is record profits for X, Y, and Z, energy companies last year, banks this year. And people just look and think, well, they're price gouging. They're not taking any of the pain. We'd be better off, like I say all the time, if we looked at some of these things in the context of after inflation adjusted returns. Because if you look at the real FTSE, for example, after adjusted for inflation, not doing very well at the moment. Not predicted to do very well next year. Similar to the housing market. In many ways, the FTSE, not that impressive for the last 20 odd years, not a million miles away from the performance of the Japanese stock market. Not as bad as Japan, because Japan had this gigantic bubble at the back of the 80s, but we haven't made a lot of progression in 23 years. So we haven't made a lot of progression in wages in real terms. That's since 2007. Now, again, you're sort of cherry picking the high watermark of those things because things were overinflated and the economy was overly hot at that time. And that's part of what led to the ingredients for the 2008 crash. But not much increase in wages, not much increase in stocks, certainly not in real terms at all. There's been a big bath in real terms in the last 23 years, even after you consider dividends. So how are the people on the street supposed to make their money? Well, the good news is organically, most people tend to, until they get to a certain point in their career, a certain inflection point or a certain age, and then their income starts to go down rather than upwards. So you still get that natural, as a person, you get that progression over time, for really as long as you're willing to keep learning for and keep putting in the hard work for, in reality. Again, not a populist kind of angle, because again, the people don't really want to hear it. Work harder for a bit more. Well, can't I just have it for free? Well, not really, because the world and the economy doesn't work like that, unfortunately. But we digress significantly before we've even really started the supplement rundown, which is probably a new record. A new record for us. That's impressive. Love it. So I'm back to my high horse of the week anyway, into the Bank of England current scenario. And of course, everybody's sort of captivated by the rates and where the rates are at the moment, the 5.25%. It's important to note the vote was 6-3 rather than 5-4. That was quite a difference, really. The other three votes were to put the rate up. So I think that kind of tells you how far away we are from seeing a rate cut just yet. You've still got three people who'd like to see 5.5 as base. And the big tell will be when that reverses a bit and it's we get a 7-2 vote, 7 to hold and 2 to cut. That will be the first really, or the next really interesting vote that the bank has, I think. The market seems to think we're done. They're not buying what the central bank is selling anymore. The same thing's going on in the US. I think the ECB have been a bit better. Christine Lagarde is doing a bit of a better job with being directive and the market's believing what she's saying, but she's saying at least 2 quarters until we have a cut in the Euro central bank. We're not as precise as that. And frankly, that's because we haven't got enough of a clue, I don't think, or we don't show as if we've got enough of a clue. It's a fine balance between the committee acting as independent individuals and then coming together to deliver a message. And that fine balance and the way they manage the media has just been appalling under Bailey, I'm afraid. He's just not a good enough communicator. And I think the press actually are reasonably easy on him. I mean, there are a few commentators who give him a hard time, myself included, but really, I think the press could really, really hold his feet to the fire, and they just don't generally bother, unfortunately. But my big bugbear of the week is the whole quantitative tightening thing. So I first asked this question about 9 months ago, I think it was, at one of the regional breakfast briefings, and said, look, so for everybody listening who doesn't quite fully understand it all, if we look at post 2009, once the interest rate is on the floor, 0.5%, there's the bank are onto their secondary ammunition, if you like. They've fired all their bullets as far as the interest rate lever goes, and then they've got to use something else. That something else is money printing, quantitative easing, pumping money into the system. Between 2010 and the early parts of 2020, that money was printed and set off into the financial system. It wasn't set off to the general public as a whole. What result did that have apart from anything else? It inflated asset values, because when debt becomes very cheap and money is freely available, then ultimately returns on debt, cost of debt for companies goes down, and the only things they consider in terms of the company structure are debt and equity. So if debt is cheap, equity performs better, not by doing anything different apart from paying out less in terms of debt. So basically a corporate gift that nobody really thought was necessarily going to last for 10 years, but 10 years it did last for. Now, of course, wobbles along the way came, Brexit, the pandemic. When the pandemic came, it was different, because they had to do more of what someone like Dalio would call QE2 or QE3, where money gets directly to the general public. Right now, this is significantly different. How did they achieve that in the UK? Well, they achieved it by bounce back loans to anybody with a pulse and a limited company. In fact, I don't think some of them had a pulse, as it goes, as I recall from some of the fraud reports, but anybody with a limited company. And also things like furlough, which got money out to the general population. What did people do during the pandemic? Well, initially they saved money because A, they were panicking, and B, they had no outlet to spend that money, or a lot of the outlets they normally would use to consume, they didn't spend that money. And then as things came back, such as holidays abroad have been vastly uptaken this year, despite us being in the middle of a supposed cost of living crisis, because people have thought, you know what, I've waited long enough and I've got savings from the pandemic, so I'm going to spend them on this. And, we're in this funny situation where we might just, if we get out of this without a significant economic event, I'll tell you now, it's luck, not judgment, right? Yeah. And it's mostly controlled by people's behavior, because people did save. Then price of things went up significantly, but they had savings. So they could subsidize the inflationary environment, right? And they've been able to do that until wages start to catch up. Since June, as I said in last week's supplement, wages have actually been ahead of inflation in real time. And there's some decent forecasting that predicts inflation. CPI is probably going to drop to about 5% when the October number comes out, which will be next week, and we'll know the answer to that. But that will look a lot more palatable than 6.7. We're behind a lot of the other big players in that, apart from Germany, who are still around about the 5.5% mark, and would obviously like to get theirs down. And then we'll see about the rest of the stubbornness. But the Bank of England pulled this lever to engage in a lot of quantitative easing, and then more was, there was supposed to be a little bit. Well, I say a little bit, $250 billion. It's not a small amount of money, but it ended up at nearly £1 trillion after we had the referendum, and then we had the pandemic. We were nearly at £1 trillion in the asset purchase facility. Now, from a technical perspective, all they're doing is, but there was a little bit of corporate bonds, but we'll leave those to one side for the purposes of trying to keep it relatively understandable. So they bought government bonds. So printed money, gave to the Treasury, right? What does the Treasury do? Well, it pays interest on the facility to the bank. But when a lot of that QE was being done, the interest rates were incredibly low. The coupons, I think there were 37 issuances of bonds at 1/8% coupon, rate between April 2020 and June 2021. So there's miserable and there's 0.1%, as you can imagine, but they sold in relatively significant volume. And of course, some of those were transferred to the bank. Now, the bank has essentially got two choices with what it does with those bonds. Well, it's got three choices, actually. The one that it's used over the course of the past 12 or 13 years as a rule is when they expire, they take out new bonds. So they provide the same money back to the Treasury. And this is very typical of a debt situation at a very large level. The plan is never to pay it back. The plan is to just roll the debt forever and service the interest. Nobody really wants to come out and say that because that's an awkward and inconvenient point. But look, massive companies do the same thing, right? They just roll the debt and and it's because it magnifies the equity returns. You know, there's a good business reason for doing it. It's underpinned most of private equity's strategy since debt got very cheap in 2009 and beyond, right? So they could roll over, right? And that's the first thing they've done. They could do what they, first of all, said they would do and have been doing since they decided once the rates were going up, they didn't need this quantitative easing anymore. They could let those bonds expire, right? So the bonds expire and the money is paid back. Probably. There might be some salty accounting that sometimes goes on at some points, but that theoretical money is paid back, right? And so that would be holding them to maturity. And that's a legitimate enough tactic because it doesn't mess with the market. There's this third tactic, which they've also been using in the past 12 months, which is actively selling those bonds into the secondary market, right? So what does that do? And I did the maths, as I usually do, did the research. 22.7% of all the bond sales, of all the new bond issuances in the last 12 months, that's how much the Bank of England have pumped back into the secondary market. Now, really, really simple economics, right? Supply and demand meet to set price, right? So there's 22.7% more supply than anybody would necessarily want or choose. Now, you could argue the DMO, the Debt Management Office, have issued fewer bonds because the Bank of England's pumping this supply into the secondary market. But I'm not sure there's any validity to that argument because the DMO are independent of the BOE and the DMO essentially work for the Treasury. They don't work for the independent Bank of England. So if you've got 22.7% more out there than you should have of supply, what happens to the price? Well, it forces the price down, which forces the yields up. So therefore, the bond yields are higher than they would otherwise be. And I've shared, and frankly, in a relatively mocking fashion, which I'm not proud of, but I can't see any other way to deal with the correspondence.
I'm proud of it. Yeah.
Well, I think Pete, why the governor of the Bank of England isn't called out for this sort of stuff, I just do not know, because it basically says in this letter, look, we thought this was a good idea, seems to be going all right, nothing's really gone wrong. It's quite difficult to measure the impact that it's having. So it's all okay, nothing to see here, move on, Mr. Chancellor. And of course, the Chancellor replies by saying, go on, sorry.
You should have here Polish president of the central bank. He's hilarious. Like he's like a uncle on a party and drunk, and it's like he talks such rubbish. It's unbelievable to listen. I think that seemed pretty okay.
It's all relative, Piotr, as you've just proven. Absolutely, it's all relative. But but to an extent, there has to be an element of, you know, if people went around telling the truth all the time, confidence might well be shattered in the economy. It's not my objective. It's my objective to find out what might happen on the back of it and what they might be missing apart from anything else. So yeah, the Chancellor sort of replies and says, yeah, well, this is your job, so I sort of believe you because I have to, and I'm not doing that bit of work because it's your job, and there we go. So we'll just get on with it, shall we, for the moment. But anybody could throw a dart and say, okay, if I framed it as maybe the mortgage rates are 0.25% higher than they would otherwise be if it wasn't for this insistence on supplying these bonds back to the secondary market, then how would everybody feel then? Well, that'd be pretty unpopular, wouldn't it, really? Because although it's 0.25%, it's 0.25% that's hurting people at the moment, especially who are on variable rates. And instead, what the bank have done is said, after their September meeting, said, well, actually, because it's going so well, in inverted commas, even though we can't measure that or prove that in any way, next year we're going to sell more bonds into the secondary market. So we're going to sell 50 billion rather than 45. And I just think that's going the wrong way. I don't know why they're doing it. And when the question's asked at the regional meetings as to why is now the time for quantitative tightening, I had a relatively short but understandable answer many months ago that was basically around, well, you know, we don't need that lever anymore because we've got our original lever back. Okay, I see that. But should we not be seeking to minimise fallout and disruption? And, you know, one of the things that I'm nearly furious about, really, relatively incandescent, I would say, is that the bank have, for once, the Treasury have made £124 billion profit on these trades because the bank have bought them, right? Either they've held them to maturity, and look, that's a bit of a false profit, but it's better than selling at a loss into the secondary market, right? And the bank intervened when Liz Truss was doing her darndest, worst stuff, and the bank did what everybody should always do as a trader. They bought high to sell low. And they bought at very high yields back in October last year in 2022. And then they were able to move those bonds away in the secondary market when things had calmed down. The perfect trade, if you like. And we've obviously got a woeful record at this stuff. Gordon Brown selling off the gold stocks when the price was historically ridiculous to do that. The intervention in 2008-9 with the bank bailouts and buying shares. We bought more shares in the worst companies because they needed the money more. Then we sold them off. You know, I mean, we just couldn't have. We are rubbish at this sort of stuff. For once, we've got 124 billion of profit, and the bank has sort of passed a comment saying, "Well, we'll probably sort of give all that back now over the next sort of few years." It's like, hang on a second, we're going to write off another $1/8 of a trillion, which comes out of the taxpayer's pocket, of course, because we think we should be selling these bonds off a bit more quickly. I'm sorry, that's just not good enough. I'm not happy with that. And that's why the soapbox was on full hammer this week about that relatively technical point. But there's so much money involved. You know, we get animated over benefits cheats swindling 30 grand out of something or whatever. 124 billion pounds. So a big number that you can't get your head around. You know, it sounds like it's made up. But we're just going to go, well, we sort of made that over these trades. So now we need to get that. And there's no reason. There's no real demonstrable reason why this is the best policy at the moment. And I just think it is a case of, I understand. And look, I've said in the supplement, I've got a conflict of interest here because I don't want the bond yields higher than they should otherwise be. Of course I have, right? But the bank seems to have this tunnel focus on it and not really care about the other impacts that it's having. You could argue that falsely keeping the bond yields up is actually helpful for the interest rate calamity to bite a bit more than it otherwise would do. But I don't know. There's a few analysts far more senior and far more well-respected than I who are saying this won't go on for the duration until we get rid of the whole facility. So we were at about 900 billion in the asset purchase facility. We're down to about 750. So we are going in the right direction. But we will then, after next year, be down at about 650. But getting it below sort of 400 or 500 billion before there being another problem apart from anything else will be interesting. So there was another little interesting bit rather than go on, Joe, sorry.
I was about to say, is there a part of this is it a mix between this is what we've always done, and is it a mix between we've never actually done a good trade like this before? We don't know how to capitalize.
We don't know how to book a W. we don't know how to book W's. We only book L's. Yeah.
You know, are they still working in the loser mentality? Have they not realised that actually this is a win? How do we capitalise on this, and how does that benefit? You know, what's the trickle down economics of that? I love using those terms. Like, is it just like this is what we do in this situation? There's no one sitting there going, well, we could evolve our thinking here to be, why don't we do X, and the impact of X is Y. These are mathematical people. It shouldn't be a difficult stretch for them to go, well, let's work on statistics and probabilities, and let's see what route we could go down where it has the best outcome.
Look, I hope I understand the brief of the Bank of England and what they're there to do, right? But I would also like to think there's some element of fiduciary responsibility to not set fire to an eighth of £1 trillion. I don't think that's unreasonable, is it? Realistically,
Doesn't feel unreasonable. Doesn't feel
it. So I don't know why they are doing things the way that they are. And I can't think of a good reason for doing it apart from we're already doing it, so we're going to carry on doing it. And I don't think that history as we go on will be that kind to Andrew Bailey, nor will it probably be to Mark Carney, because there are points in the past which you pick out and think, well, hold on. I think it was about 2014 or 15, if memory serves me correctly, where Carney said, look, once unemployment goes below 6%, we're going to start jacking the interest rate back up, right? And we just didn't. We just didn't have a go. Instead, referendum came and we dropped it even more. And the furthest we got was back to 0.75% from our 0.5% 2009 state of play before the pandemic came, and we had to get down to 0.1, the lowest that we'd ever used. I think they'd skillfully set the rate at 0.5%, although in March 2009 that might have been more luck than judgment, just to leave a bit of room in there. But we just didn't try hard enough to get the rates back at any point, which have then led to a meteoric rise in rates. And the reality is, the smaller the business, the smaller the individual, the less sophisticated financially you are, the more it hurts you. So so you can understand why, 2010, movements like Occupy Wall Street were at their absolute height because of such disenchantment with the system. But the small person has taken this kicking. This was all needed, this stuff, the QE, the low interest rate, it was all needed in order to mop up what happened in the financial crisis. But where the incidence of the pain really has been felt is on everybody, because that's how taxation ultimately works and how the system ultimately works. And there isn't appetite, or there's been limited appetite. I mean, obviously there have been windfall taxes for energy companies, apart from anything else. But there's been limited appetite and the bankers' bonus caps was about as far as we got with trying to reclaim it from the banking system, and the levying corporation tax, to be fair, but nothing like the size of the damage that was caused by that crisis. And you've just lurched from one effective, really significant event to another. There's been 28 crises in the news in the last 4 years, probably. But in the last 15, there's been some real ones. Financial crisis, referendum upset a lot of apple carts in markets. And then the pandemic, of course, a genuine situation. So all of those need due consideration. But I just don't see how 1 and 1 makes 2 here. And it just frustrates. And I'm a bit frustrated because I can't tell you what the answer is, because I like to try and answer the questions. But 2, I get frustrated because I don't see anybody else talking about it. I don't see it getting any headlines, and nobody seems to care enough, even though the sums of money involved are utterly eye-watering. I had a message from a consultancy client this morning saying, I can't really understand what goes on with quantitative easing and quantitative tightening, because whenever I look into it, there always seems to be a bit of dark arts and sorcery involved. And I'm like, yeah, pretty. And then I just kind of have to trust that the bank's doing the right thing. I'm like, I agree with all of that, apart from the last part. Yeah, realistically, because things do have to be called out when they're going wonky. So that was my soapbox for the week. A bit longer than usual. Sorry about that, but we can start talking about Nadine Dorries again if you want, Jay, or anybody else of that ilk. If there are.
No, there's an episode of South Park, and sometimes these shows are really good social commentators, right? And South Park, for one, doesn't really hold any punches. But obviously, it's during the pandemic, and they're all going through this whole. They're regressing into like almost caveman style form in terms of not wanting to spend money on new things, or spending money on so many things that the value of everything crashes, and there's a big argument over a margarita maker. So the margarita maker is broken. They go back to the store. The store says, this isn't our problem. You got it on a finance contract, so you have to speak to the finance company. And then it goes back and back and back and back and back. They find themselves in New York at Wall Street. And the guys are like, well, we want our money back. This is faulty. So then these 4 suits, these 4 bankers, just basically pull a goat out of nowhere, slit its throat, throw some bones on the ground, and go, okay, yeah, no, the finance that product is now gone. You lose the margarita maker. And then they go, wait, what just happened? He goes, do you want to open a savings account? They go, yeah, we'll open a savings account. And he goes, oh, now that money's gone. So it's just kind of highlights the fact that it is kind of a bit of black magic. What kind of happens there? It's kind of like it's all kind of machinations and imaginations. And I thought actually the way that you said it earlier just reminded me of that episode, and how it actually is probably just dark arts. Like the higher up you go, it's probably just a wish and a prayer.
When we wanted the money in 2009, we printed it and we pumped it into the financial institutions. But instead of then reversing that process, what we do is we sell it into the secondary market at a loss. So we just give that money away. And because we are the Bank of England, not only that, we have to telegraph exactly what we're doing and when we're doing it, so that every bond trader can just go, right, well, I know the Bank of England is going to sell £8 billion worth of bonds on that day. I wonder how hard that would be for a trader to make a profit from. Not very hard at all. What's the best way around that? Don't participate in that trade when you're the bloody central bank. Don't participate in it. Don't do it. Right, it's nuts. It gives money away. And I'm not up for giving money away.
It almost sounds like they're giving insider trading tips to people, by taking part in it. They're like, okay, one of the biggest financial fish in the country is about to do X. I'm being forewarned that X is about to happen in X amount of time. How do I structure a hedge against X? Simply. Even if you're half skilled, you'll find out, it feels like they're allowing the system to be gamed, massively gamed.
Well, you know what? There was well, yeah, they're at the heart of it. They're signalling it and everything. I mean, there was a when I was heavily involved in Betfair trading, there's an amazing documentary series that I don't know if you can still get it. It'd be on iPlayer if it was, because it was a BBC thing, and it was called Jackpot, and it had all these episodes of different, not necessarily professional punters, because they wouldn't all be winners apart from anything else, but gamblers of significance, let's call them, right? And there's a guy called Terry Ramsden, who in the 80s was a Japanese futures trader, and he was the top dog of punting in the UK at the time. So Ladbrokes would fly him around in his own helicopter, right, with a bookmaker by his side. Now, because Terry used to have a method, he used to bet on credit in those days, and he would still I mean, bear in mind, it's the 80s, right? So the internet is, not there in any meaningful way, shape or form. So he would go into his local Ladbrokes if he wanted to have a bet at lunchtime when he was taking a break from the trading desk, and he would write things like £5 forecast, and that was shorthand for £5,000 forecast. So a forecast, for anyone who doesn't know, is predicting, it was usually greyhounds was his poison. Greyhounds are horses. Which dogs were going to come first and second in that order. So he would bet 5k on that event, a really massive bet, whereas a typical bet would be a couple of quid. He'd bet 5k. And what happens in these situations is, he was flown around with his own personal bookmaker from Ladbrokes who would set his odds. So let's say he wanted, the last race of the day when you're racing over the jumps is normally what's called a bumper or a national hunt flat race, right? So it's horses that normally race over the jumps with no jumps. So it's quite unpredictable because the form is completely thrown out apart from anything else. There'll be lightly raced horses. And also, dare I say it, not every horse in every race has been trying to its full potential. I know that will surprise the general public, but that's horse racing for you, right? And say Terry had a bad day, he might try and have a bet. They were talking about one incident I remember where he wanted to have 300 grand on the favourite at 9-4, right? So the maths on that isn't easy, but say he wanted to have 400 grand on. If it won, he would win 900 plus his original 400, right? So you get back 1.3 million quid. This was 1988 or something like that. So that's a decent bet, very decent bet. And the job of the guy with him in the Ladbrokes helicopter was to say, well, Terry, the thing is, can't put 300 grand on at 9-4. The price will completely collapse. So we'll have to get you a different price. Well, what price will it be? 1 to 3. So instead of his 300 grand making like 780 if it won, his 300 would only win 100 grand. So imagine, hard enough to win at gambling anyway, right, in the first place. But having the odds chopped against you so much like that, it's basically impossible. And it was free money for Ladbrokes. And because he was desperate to get his money back on the day, and because he was making mega tens of millions or whatever, he would accept that treatment. Now, in this day and age, what would happen is you would go into the market, and if you wanted to have a bet like that, especially on a bumper where there wouldn't be much liquidity, you would move the price from 9 to 4. Probably you'd end up on an average of about even money or maybe slight odds on, right? Because you would literally dictate the market because of the size of that wager, but you'd be up against every other person in the market on the betting exchanges. So where Ladbrokes laid him at 1 to 3, he would probably end up at an average of about even money for the same sort of bet. So he was being mugged to the tune of 3 times more than he should have been by the bookmaker. But of course, the bookmaker was doing his job apart from anything else. And this is the same sort of situation. Normally, these trades would be in the millions of pounds, right? Or in the hundreds of thousands of pounds even, the millions and the low millions. And there might be, a few billion traded in a day. Whereas Bank of England are going to put their hand up and say, we're selling 8 billion that day. So is that okay? Everyone okay with that? It's not going to change anything, is it? Anybody going to do anything different on the basis that we're offering it? And guess what? We're going to sell it at the market price. So we're going to sell it. We're not going to get a trader to go, well, I'm not selling it at that. I'll wait till tomorrow. I'll wait. No, we're not going to do that. We're just going to go, here you go. There it is. Just put a big flag up. We're just going to start. It's like the equivalent of going to an auction with your hand up and just go, I'm bidding for this lot. Yeah, okay. When are you stopping? No, I'm not stopping. Not stopping. You just keep going. Keep going. There's my hand. Well, what are you playing at? Well, it's not my money, is it? So never mind. Never mind.
I've seen that twice.
Deeply upsetting. Deeply upsetting.
It's so scary. In auction, I've seen it happen twice where both one was a short lease flat in Neasden, kind of Wembley Neasden area. The lady came in and she just stood straight facing the auctioneer, just kept her hand up, didn't pay attention to what was going around her, just really didn't care, and maybe overpaid by about 80 grand, 90 grand. That was a bit of a that was bad news bears.
Which is about like
the other one
60% of the price. So she overpaid by 60%.
Yeah, that was bad news. And then the other one was a lady who flew over from America, landed the morning of the auction, didn't view the property, but some family in the UK viewed some property for her, told her that the house in Fulham didn't have a roof. Not only did it not have a roof, it hadn't had a roof for close to 10 years. Right, so it's a complete wreck. Flew over, landed, came to the auction, had a copy of The Sun in her hand, and then just kept it up like that. And paid market value. So without extending into the basement, to the rear and into the loft, she paid market value for the asset, which was an absolute ruin on a lovely road in Fulham. It was perfect auction lot. The worst property in the best street, in the best area kind of thing. And then obviously did all of the extensions, but they're never selling. It's a family trust. So she could have behaved like that, and it doesn't matter what she paid for it. It's not her money. It's money that's been accrued over generations that she can just waste, right? But those are 2 times I've seen people completely unfazed, like just didn't care about the conditions or whatever was going on around them, didn't want to get a sense of the room, just decided that my will is law today, and the law is that I'm winning this asset, and that's exactly
this would be an interesting case study for that. There's this in America, CoStar and kind of associated companies. They've got this game called Battle of the Bids, where people basically, like commercial agents and investors, they register for the game, and they have to guess the selling prices of 10 auction lots that are offered, and there are like serious cash prices from like $1,000 to $100,000, and I think it would be really interesting to do that for the UK and have those
agreed
kind of really
sounds like good fun. Yeah,
strange properties, and people kind of trying to predict what this crazy lady from the US might pay for this.
What do you think the equivalent is in the online auction world of keeping your hand up? Is it just like holding the left button of the mouse down, basically? Is it the
I think it's like having a Parkinson on the mouse.
Like having one
auto
of
clicker?
those muscle machines that just go boom, 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 get one of those.
Yeah.
Also making a proxy bet.
But to put Adam's like example, for people at home that don't know about trading and stuff, for that guy, like normally if you're doing deals, like on the trading floor, I'm thinking if you're doing deals in that size, normally it would work the other way around. You'd be able to get a better price. You'd be able to get a better discount when you're trading in that size. The way they execute a deal has to be done very specifically and very slowly, usually very cautiously, to not move the market. In that example, not to move the odds, but would normally work the other way around. You normally get a better price rather than actually working kind of against you. So it's a great example. It's a great example.
So
That's a really,
if you have that volume and you break that volume up into sections and then execute those sections independently, so the market moves, but it doesn't feel like it's being moved by a single entity.
But that drives investment banks mad, because they don't know. Yeah. They've lost transparency of what's going on. So you would get big clients, particularly hedge funds, that would do that. They'd have a chunk to do and they split it up between different banks, but they would tend to execute at the same time such that the market and the price didn't move away from them, but then the bank gets fucked over and then the bank doesn't want to deal with you anymore, because there's only a certain number of times you can fuck a bank over before they'll just go and you too. So
it's funny that there's a finite number of fuckovers you can do for a bank, but not a number of fuckovers a bank can do to you. It's interesting how that facility works.
But that was your job as a salesperson, to kind of keep that relationship with the client, to say, give me the whole size, we'll work. That sounded very wrong. Give me the whole trade. Christ. Give me the whole trade.
I believe some investment banks work like that, Helen, but I can't imagine you would have been involved in any such behaviour.
Oh God.
There's a couple of questions from Dominic. One, what about those who are taking betting advantage of the reporting time delay in cricket scores when Australia versus England?
Oh, I've got lots of great clock beating stories that, a lot of people don't realise this. If they bet on what looks like a live event on Sky Sports, for example, little spoiler alert for you, it's not live, right? So in theory, there are clock delays in various places that are there to protect the retail punters. But in reality, if you Google clock beating operations, I know a couple of the largest clock beating operators in the tennis market who did it for years and years and years, until what effectively happened is capitalism took over and the ATP realised that real-time information was more important than people in the crowd with James Bond style kit in their pockets or whatever, and they started using the umpires to relay the scores in real time to bookmakers and set up a feed which makes the ATP millions and millions of pounds a year. And this is how clever and how this is the equivalent of, you've heard of the hedge fund that drills through the mountain so it can get 1/1,000,000th of a second latency less than its opposition, and has the fastest internet and all the rest of it. And there's huge competition for that. This is the betting equivalent of that in the smaller markets. These days, although the umpire presses the button for the score and then the decision is relayed, you still have people who will go to tennis matches who will look for a usually, I'm afraid to say, rather elderly umpire, which it can be something that's taken up by people in the twilight of their years, who is a bit doddery and a bit slow, and they can still beat to the punch because they go sort of press the button over here, whereas Johnny with his tools in his pocket, if you'll pardon the phrase there again, we've drifted quite a long way this morning without meaning to, will be able to still execute a trade more quickly. So there are all sorts. Clock beating has been going on ever since there's been in-running betting, and it will always go on, and it's a huge advantage. So what you would do is you would see people pump in walls of liquidity when they knew the answer before the rest of the market did. And they would basically hoover up everything that was there. And if you ever watch, it's actually, and maybe it's just me, but watching a tennis match on Betfair in real time in terms of how volatile the odds are, it's incredible. Because Helen will tell you, of your average trader, volatility is normally their friend. So if you understand and got a rough idea of what you're doing, then it can be very advantageous to you. But the swings in the price, especially near the end of the game, because one double fault or even a first serve or a point going 15-30 instead of 30-15 can be absolutely gigantic. It's really, really interesting, but not for the faint-hearted. And please don't take this as an endorsement of in-running betting, because if you think you've got an edge, believe me, I could tell you some stories and introduce you to some people who've got real edges, and it is frightening the lengths that people would go to and just the level of ability that they've got. Just as it is when Helen and I get on our respective soapboxes about people trading Forex, for example, and make out like they've got the fund that makes 8% a month or whatever. And it's like, of course you have. And you would obviously just offer that to me, your new friend on Facebook, immediately, because if you were making 8% a month, you'd need to raise tons of capital for that.
Next comment from Craig. Craig just posted the link to the article about this Battle of the Bids competition. It is for the US brokers and US investors only, so not great, but we might create one for the UK, right, Jay?
Yeah, do
We'll
it.
have to buy the license, but yeah, it's possible. Yeah.
No, we'll just create our own thing.
Just create our own thing. Yeah. Who needs
Not
to do
buying anything.
Oh, the Bank of Dave. That was he set that up years ago. At least tried to, didn't he? He was a very interesting guy.
Oh, I've not heard of that.
Oh, that's well worth watching on Netflix. That is, Helen.
Yeah.
Apart from anything else, the way that the way that they portray won't ruin the film, but the way they portray the way that the system tries to stop him it makes it a great story. Great story.
Yeah.
I'll love it just to listen to the Burnley accents as well. It's my neck of the woods.
Nice. Wow.
It's also got AC/DC in, which is quite cool.
Yeah, I watched that movie, but I thought it was in Birmingham, not Burnley, but maybe I just...
Very different accent.
Yeah. Anyway, never mind.
But you thought Aberdeen had a beach, so we'll let you off.
Oh, brilliant. Well, I wonder what's going to happen with the auctions in the next not couple of months, 3 months, basically, if the interest rates are not moving, because every time interest rates were moving, that was causing problems for the auctions. And every 2 or 3 days, a week after the Bank of England meeting, auctions would struggle. Now they struggle without those increases, but after a while, people kind of get adjusted to things. So wonder what's that going to be like.
I think you've got a lot of people at the moment on floating rates who are running stuff at losses, and their overall thoughts, which I have been speaking against all year, are that rates are going to come down again pretty soon. I have said in a supplement today, though, that I do think things probably will come back down a little bit quicker than the market expects at the moment. But to put that into context, the market expects the first cut to be Q3 next year, by which point we will have had 5.25% for a year. And they expect the base rate to still be 4.25% at the end of 2026. Now, I don't think it will be. I think this is an absolute classic where it took them way, way too long to get on the bus with what was going on. And now finally they've got on the bus, they're trying to stay on for too long, and they're overestimating it. So I would be surprised if we only lost 1% off base in the next 3 years. But, that's just my people tend to overreact. That's just what markets have done since the dawn of time. And they're still overreacting. We've got a very flat economy. At some point, there's going to need to be some kind of stimulus to come into it. Whether that's caused by political pressure or not, I'm not really sure. But the problem is that, you know, we're still in the real world, we're still dealing with 2008 because the pain wasn't taken. And we're absolutely still dealing with 2020, you know, and will be for decades. So it's very, very difficult, because you do what Jeremy Hunt did at the budget last year when he came in to sort of steady the ship. That was a good thing, was he did what's needed at the moment, which is cut back the size of government, right? And I've been someone who's been very vocal about how terrible a policy austerity was, but really maybe not vocal enough about why it was such a terrible policy. It's more the timing that was the problem, not that government didn't need cutting back. And of course, at a very, very simple high level, when you've had a pandemic and a gigantic expansion of the state, then when that's over, what you need is a cutback of the state. One of the successes of the last 40 years as a rule has been the cutback of the state. Then you get a Boris, who is a big state person anyway, likes the idea of big government, gets away with that. All the conservative ideologues, just whether they didn't understand it or whether they just didn't want to hear it because their man was in and he was the big winner and he was going to lead them to election victories and they didn't care. But he wants to expand the state massively. Whereas at the moment, we haven't got the tax revenue in order to justify doing all of that. And actually, austerity would be well timed. Now, what's happened instead is Jeremy Hunt's kicked that austerity can down to 2026, 27, 28, which is very clever if you think about it. Because I'm sure at the time he was probably thinking, bloody hell, we've just elected someone who couldn't last as long as a lettuce as the Prime Minister. We're probably going to lose the next election. So let's leave Labour to do all these cuts, and then they'll be extremely unpopular by the time we come back to politics, and are fighting again for government in 2029 or whenever that will be. But really, we could have done with eating the frog and doing a few more cuts earlier on than we otherwise did, because apart from anything else, what would austerity have achieved over the last 12 to 18 months, right? It would have achieved lower inflation.
Yeah. It
would have achieved lower inflation. And I'm not going for, I don't know if anybody's been, how interested people are in American politics and stuff, but I've been listening to a fair few bits with Vivek Ramaswamy on, who's this sort of 38-year-old near billionaire, relatively extreme in some of his views to an extent, not extreme in a, I mean, the National Front kind of extreme way, just in terms of just quite how polarized they are. And I mean, he's got a plan for the US which sees them cutting government heads by 75%, which is phenomenally. There'd be some concerns that I'd have there in terms of who would take advantage of that situation, apart from anything else. And I'd prefer to be talking about taxing people adequately, but then that's why I'd never be a Republican candidate, apart from anything else. But he's got a pretty good handle on how big and inefficient the state has got. And of course, the US has got much bigger problems than we have with things like what they call regulatory capture, where, you know, the agencies, if you watch, what's it called? Is it called Painkiller? I think it is. Netflix documentary about the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma. Yeah, worth watching. But that tells you a lot about, you know, the one person who approved that drug at the FDA, you know, suddenly miraculously in a few years' time finds himself as an incredibly well-paid consultant to Purdue Pharma. There's a bit of a smoke and mirrors about how he gets there, but look, we all know what's gone on there, and that is problematic. And one of the things that Vivek is saying is that you should be banned from crossing the Rubicon. So if you've worked in policy, going and working in private practice, there's a 10-year ban because it stops this from happening. Because what's happening at this top level in terms of, and I think even a lot of the relatively right-wing or at least fiscal conservatives, let's say, are coming to the conclusion that crony capitalism is the problem, right? Capitalism is not the problem. Capitalism has solved an awful lot of problems over several hundred years. But Matt Hancock's pub landlord getting awarded PPE contracts, anybody who doesn't think that's a problem needs to give their head a bit of a wobble in reality. And that's what needs to stop. And, you know, I was sad to see this week, didn't make it into the supplement, but the UK is sliding down the ranks of least corrupt countries in the world and has gone down from, you know, 5th, 6th, 7th down to about 18th at the moment. And that's a sad, these are not this is not left-wing propaganda. This is a symptomatic sign of a corrupt system that needs changing. And this is not a party political broadcast for the Labour Party, because I'm not sure how they're going to achieve it either. But one way of doing it is you do curtail the powers of government, you do curtail the amount of money you pump into government. And when it would have been disinflationary, wouldn't that have been a good time to do it? But, who thinks about common sense things like we've talked about today? Who is interested in them at the governmental level? Precisely no one.
Yeah.
And on that note, just past an hour.
On that powerful note. Yeah.
Powerful note.
Thank you for letting me beat the chest quite so hard today, but that's my catharsis for the week achieved, and balance will be restored to the Lawrence household.
Amazing.
Wow.
Go ahead, Jay.
I was going to say, have a good week, everybody. There's opportunities everywhere if you're alive to them. Just keep on keeping on. Nothing is all doom and gloom. There's plenty of fun to be had, and sometimes it's down to the individual to create that fun for everyone to benefit from it. So let's just keep on going.
Amazing. Another powerful note. Have a great Sunday, everyone. Speak to you.
Great week.